they could all sing that song. And the way that they lived their lives testified that they believed that. So this morning I want you to open your Bibles and I want you to turn to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. Our key verse for this morning is going to be verse 27. When you get there, then you can flip back into the Old Testament to Exodus chapter 2. We're going to be bouncing back and forth this morning. But in Hebrews chapter 11, in verse 27, the author says, speaking of Moses, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. So this morning we continue our series, The Stories of Faith, and we're going to continue to, of course, look at the story of Moses. Last week we saw the defining moments of Moses' life by the choices that he made. Those choices that he made set his life on a totally different trajectory than the way that it was going. We saw how Moses, he was pretty much in place to become the next world ruler. But he came to this place in his life where he could no longer live. He could no longer live the life that wasn't for him. He woke up one day in the palace of Pharaoh and he made the choice. He made the choice to be refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And so Moses, he decided to put an end to this chapter of his life and begin to write one that he, should have been writing the whole time. He makes the choice to forfeit all the wealth and all the treasures of Egypt. You remember for what? For something better, for something easier, right? Now it says, for the reproach of Christ. For he was looking for the reward that is stored in heaven. But as we've been looking at these stories, and Moses' story here in Hebrews chapter 11, the author here in Hebrews 11, he's only given us kind of the highlight reel of Moses' life. He's giving us the parts of Moses' life that, Moses would tell if it was up to him. We could say that we're seeing the Facebook story of Moses' life. Now, those of you that are on Facebook, you know what I'm saying. You put the best pictures of your family. You put the best pictures of your children. You take pictures of your vacation so you can make everyone else jealous that is at home working, right? You project this image to everyone else so everyone will think what a wonderful and perfect picture of life that you live. Kind of like this. This is the picture you put on Facebook, right? Everybody's smiling, we're having a good time. This awesome little family, right? But this is the picture you don't put on. Can you believe all I did was ask for a sandwich? I showed this picture just because if my body ever comes up missing, in the future, you are all witnesses, okay? You're all witnesses. Huh? They're with you? They'll understand. Like, yeah, I saw it coming. But you see, every story has chapters in it with pages that are filled with bad choices, of failures, of mistakes. We have pages of sadness, of grief and heartache. There's chapters in our life where we just wish they didn't exist. There are parts of our story that we wish never happened, but what I want you to focus on and what I want you to see this morning is that God can use the chapters of regret of your life to fulfill in you a different outcome to the story. Because while we are told that when Moses left Egypt, as he was leading some 2 million Israelites out of bondage, it says he left. He left not fearing the wrath of the king. See, we're given a picture here of Moses in full faith leaving Egypt. Not concerned one bit with Pharaoh. I mean, we see here a picture of Moses marching right up to the most powerful man in the world and saying, let my people go. But if you know the story of Moses, you know that wasn't always the narrative of Moses' life. There was a chapter in his life that was very similar to this one, but it had a very different outcome. Look at Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse 11. In Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse 11. It says, now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up, that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And so he looked this way and that, and when he saw there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the next day, and behold, two Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." And when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh. You see, Moses wasn't always this man that was without fear, that always had great faith. He wasn't always this man who was, the leader and willing to confront his fear. Because we see here in Exodus chapter 2, when he decided to get involved with the conflict between his people and the Egyptians, we see that Moses, he is led by his emotions. He acts according to what he is feeling. He sees a picture. He sees a great injustice being done to one of his brothers, and he takes the situation into his own hands. Now, did you notice what Moses did right before he made the choice to kill the Egyptian? It says he looked this way and that, and when he saw there was no one around. We could say that Moses, he looked every which way but up. He looked around and saw no one around. We must understand this, that every chapter in our story will turn out painful if we disregard the presence of God in our lives. You see, Moses, he looked to make sure no one was looking, but he forgot to recognize the one who sees everything. In this moment, Moses wasn't fearing the disapproval of God, but he was fearing the disapproval of man. Moses, he was fearing what he could see, not the one he couldn't see. And you see, because of this one choice to act outside of the presence of God, the next chapters of Moses' life will be chapters filled with fear, with loneliness, and insecurities. We see he flees. He flees in fear, not in fear of God, but in fear of Pharaoh. Because what he had thought he had hidden so well now comes to the surface. But what I want you to see this morning is that even in this chapter, this section of Moses' life, as it is in turmoil each day Moses writes another page in fear. Each day he writes another page filled with regret, with guilt and shame. Even in this story, even in this chapter of Moses' story, we see that God has not given up on the story that could be Moses' life. We see that God is able to change the story, to help us put a period on the end of a chapter of our life and give us an opportunity to write another page. To begin a new chapter that is filled with hope, that is filled with direction and meaning. We see for 40 years Moses lives out in the desert keeping the flocks of his father-in-law. And it's in those chapters of Moses' life that we could title stagnation or just existing. You know those chapters. You've had those chapters in your life where maybe it's a set of circumstances that you brought on yourself or somebody else forced upon you. And it just seems like you're just living. You're not really living, you're just existing. You're just going from one day to the next. Your mind is what? It's on the past. Moses, in this chapter of his life, we see that God comes to him to wake him up from his slumber. You flip over to chapter 3 of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. It says, "Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. Now you know when God says your name twice that you're in big trouble, right? And he said, here I am. What's interesting about this manifestation of this God revealing himself to Moses, he doesn't speak to Moses until when? Until he has Moses' attention. It says, when the Lord saw that, he turned aside to look. Why did Moses make that one choice, that one decision that's been making him write all these chapters of regret and fear? It's because he looked around. He looked to the left, he looked to the right, he saw no one was around. Here, God has to get Moses' attention. And it says when he saw him turn aside to look, that's when God called to him. Maybe that's the reason why we don't hear God in certain chapters of our life. Because we're still looking to the right, looking to the left. We're looking at men. We're looking at people. Until God gets our attention, he won't speak. It goes on to say in verse 5, it says, then he said, do not come near here. Don't come any closer, Moses. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. You see, when God reveals himself, he reveals, first of all, his holiness. He reveals the difference between us and him. You remember when Isaiah was met with the holiness of God. And what was Isaiah's response? He said, woe is me, for I am undone. For I am a man, I live among people with simple lips. I have the same. You see, when we come into an encounter with God, we encounter his holiness. And it lets us see who we really are. He goes on to say in verse 6, he said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then did Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. For the last 40 years, Moses has been afraid of Pharaoh. He's been fearing Pharaoh and what Pharaoh could do in his life. But now that he comes into this encounter with God, now that he meets with God, now he fears God. You see, in this ordinary situation, in this ordinary chapter, Moses is met with the extraordinary. His story here begins to take a sharp turn. Because don't you think that Moses had this feeling, he had this conviction that he was made for so much more than just keeping those animals out in the wilderness. And I think even though Moses, even though he refused to be called Pharaoh, the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he still lived. He still lived without any sense of meaning and direction and purpose. The only thing that Moses really knows at this point is that he didn't belong in Egypt. I know I don't belong there, but what am I supposed to do? But you see, now God meets him in the mundane situations of life. And God goes on to reveal to Moses his desire, his plans. He says in verse 7, he says, the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down. I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. Now behold, look, Moses, I want you to see this. The cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. You see, Moses here, he's met by God, and God reveals to him his desire, his plan to answer the prayer of the Israelites. I'm sure Moses at this point, that's great, God. I mean, that's great that you're finally going to answer prayer. That's great that you're finally going to deliver them. How are you going to do it? What are you going to do? You're going to rain down fire and sulfur like you did on Sodom and Gomorrah? Oh, well, let me guess. You're probably going to send down some angels to do this, right? No. He says, therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. The last thing that Moses wanted to hear. The thing that he feared the most is the very thing that God is calling him to face. You ever thought about why did God choose Moses in this situation? Like, why choose Moses? Like, why did God choose a man who was wanted by Pharaoh? I mean, Pharaoh wants to kill him. And God chooses that very man to go and confront Pharaoh. I mean, God, why? Don't you know? Don't you know, God, that's why I'm out here in this desert is because of Pharaoh? I feared him. I'm staying away from him because he's going to take my life for what I've done. What? what we see here that God is wanting to do in Moses' life. God wants to deliver his people out of bondage. But what we also see is that God is wanting to deliver Moses out of the bondage that he is living in.
Amen.
Moses is living day-to-day fear of what a mere man can do. And what God is wanting Moses to learn is that he is greater than Moses' greatest fear. And that God can use our deepest regret, he can use our greatest shame to write a new chapter on God's victory. Because he says, Moses, I'm sending you to the very place that you don't want to go, to face the man that you do not want to face, so that you will understand who I am. I am sending you. I am putting this on your life, Moses, not because I need you. Don't misunderstand it, Moses. I don't need you, but because you need me. See, how else can God get us to realize our need of him if he doesn't put us in situations where only his presence is enough? Some of you wonder why the things you're going through and you think that God is punishing you. Maybe it's God trying to wake you up, trying to change you, trying to transform your life where you realize that it is his presence and his presence alone that changes the narrative of the story. Because in this moment, God has given Moses an opportunity to be a part of something great. To be a part of the story that will be told for generations and generations. I mean, as these Israelites, as they go on through generations, parents are going to pass down and they're going to speak. They're going to speak of the deliverer. They're going to speak of the one who came and set their ancestors free from bondage. God has given Moses here an opportunity to be a hero of the faith. I think Moses, spending all that time out in the wilderness, he'd just be itching. He'd just be scratching to get into the game. To have a part in God's will. But we see in verse 11, Moses said to God, who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? I mean, who am I, God? I mean, you know who I am? God, you know I'm rash. You know I act with my emotions. You know my weaknesses. You know how inadequate I am for this mission. And not only all that, God, but I killed a man. How on earth am I qualified for this mission? You see, what is Moses doing? He's trying to continue to write the same story he has been writing for all these years. His focus is on his failures, it's on his regrets, it's on his guilt. Pretty much he is telling God that the story can't be any different than the way it has always been. I think some of you have been saying that to yourselves and you've been saying that to God. As you say. You might not say it out loud. But you see it in your actions and your complacency. My marriage is just will always be this way. I mean, it's just always been this way, and that's just the way the story is going to continue. And you see, that kind of thinking makes you continue to write the same page day after day. Day after day, you write the same story, the same disappointment, the same difficulties, the same discouragement, and you continue to tell yourself and you continue to tell God that, you know what, the story won't change. And you come to grips with that. You've accepted that. For you, that's just the way the story is going to go. For some of you say, well, this is just the way that my relationship is with my kids. I mean, the story has always been written this way, and the story is always going to be wrote that way. It's just always going to be like this. There's always going to be this distance. There's always going to be this bitterness, this unforgiveness. And you leave no hope. You leave no hope for the story to ever improve, for the story to ever change, because this is just the way it's always been. But you see, what is Moses doing here? He is allowing the fear and regret of the past to dictate his future story. You see, Moses is not looking at this through the lens of what could be. He is looking at it through the lens of what had happened. And much of our lives are directed by us looking through our life with the lens of what has happened. And we use it as a crutch to keep God from changing our stories. See, we're disappointed with our life, and then someone gives us some advice on how we can improve, how we can change our story. And what do we say? We say, well, see, you don't understand. See what has happened. And then you replay, you retell a chapter in your life where something negative happened. And so now you're justified from anything ever changing in the future because what has happened. Moses, he hears from God, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh. Moses' mind, it jumps back to this chapter in his life where he packed up all of his belongings in a rush to get it out of town ASAP because of a choice he made. But you see, God here gives him an opportunity to change his story. But Moses, he goes right back to his fear and back to his failure. Because listen, God, who am I? I mean, I know who I am. I'm a murderer. God, you don't think I've tried to change the story? I mean, I really have. I've really tried to change who I am. But I fail, and I fail, and I fail. And to be honest, God, I'm okay with that. I've accepted it. This is just who I am. See, I think one of the greatest lies that Satan puts in our minds is that we will always be the same. That we always make the same decision. You ever notice when Satan speaks to you, he uses the word always? You're always going to have a problem with your mouth. You're always going to have a problem with your temper. You're always going to have a problem with this habit, with this addiction. And so, what do we do when we start telling ourselves and we start believing that? Our story's never going to change. We're going to continue to write the same story, chapter after chapter, page after page. You see, for some of you, before you can go any farther with God, what we see here in Moses is that the fear and the failure must be dealt with. Because God is not a God who lets you live controlled by fear, controlled by shame, and controlled by regret of the past. Because what we see that the God of the Bible is that He is a God of victory. He is a God of overcoming. He has never lost a battle. And He doesn't let His children, those who He calls by name, drown in failure and in the deep. He calls them. He calls them to Himself so that they can see by faith. That we can see by faith that He is the God of the miraculous, that He is the God of the impossible, and He is a God who turns the chapters of defeat and failure into chapters of victory and success. But what we see, the one key thing that has to change in our life, had to change in Moses' life, is that God has to become the central figure of the story. God has to become the central figure of the story. Moses, you can look back, and he can look back at his failure and his regret. And what was the common denominator in all those situations? He looked around everywhere except for God. He looked around for the approval of other people. He looked around for the disapproval of other people. And here, he thinks, well, you know what? I know how I am in pressure situations. I know this isn't going to turn out good, God, because I've got a track record. I've got a history. But God gives him a promise, and He gives him the key to how Moses can change his story. He says in verse 12, Moses says, who am I? Who am I? And God says, certainly I will be with you. Certainly I will be with you. What you have to understand, Moses, is that it's not about you. It's not about you. It's not about who you are and what you've done and what you haven't done and what you failed at. It's about me in your life, Moses. Because what Moses is here, he's looking at what happened in their life, and he's saying, am I greater than you? Am I greater? I mean, that's what God here is asking Moses. Moses, am I greater than your failures? Am I greater than your sin? Am I greater than your greatest fear? Because He says, I will be with you. I'm pushing you, Moses, to trust me in a way that you never have before. I'm calling you, Moses, to take me at my word, to take me at my promise. Because my presence in your life, I want you to understand, Moses, that it writes a different story. It writes a new story. And you don't have to continue to live this story, Moses. You don't have to continue to live in fear of what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't have to live in fear of every time that you hear a noise, if that is Pharaoh's soldiers coming to finish the job.
Amen.
You don't have to live in bondage anymore, Moses. Because I'm a deliverer. I have come down to set my people free.
Amen.
And I want you to understand, Moses, that what I do, I heal, I redeem, I restore, and I reveal all that which is broken. But Moses, there's one thing I've got to get you to do. I've got to get you to take your focus off of yourself. I've got to get you to take your focus off of those previous chapters, Moses. For me to write a new story, you've got to put your focus on me. And what did the verse say? Hebrews chapter 12, verse 27. It says, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. And it says, for he endured. He continued on. He kept going. Even when the odds were against him, even when he had every reason to fear, he kept right on going. Why? As seeing him who is unseen. Moses, by faith, he put his focus on the presence of God. And if you look at Moses' life, you'll notice there was one thing that Moses concerned himself with throughout the whole rest of his life. And that was the presence of God. When God was leading them, there came a time that God got angry and upset. There were times that God wanted to take the children of Israel out and just start a new one with Moses. But there was one thing that Moses was always concerned with for the rest of his life, and that was the presence of God. There were times when Moses said, God, if your presence doesn't go with us, then don't lead us up out of here. Because I know how the story goes. I know how the story goes when your presence isn't in my life. I understand what happens when you're not with me. I understand who I become. I understand the decisions that I make. I understand the pain that I endure when you're not with me. And so he says, I'll keep on going. I can go through anything. I can endure anything. I can patiently wait 40 years in the wilderness with a bunch of stiff-necked, hard-hearted people if your presence is with me. Each chapter you are with me will be a chapter of hope, direction, meaning, but also of victory. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.